Hi, sorry about that delay. I got a bit confused, everyone. My apologies. I just want to say a warm welcome to all of you who are joining us this evening. My name is Gladys, and this webinar is hosted by Dublin West Community Church. You may have come across us on meetup.com or Facebook. Now, this is the third in a series entitled A Life Worth Living, in which we aim to both explore and sometimes challenge present-day cultural views on what it means to live meaningful and flourishing lives. And tonight we will be looking at hope amidst the pandemic, which takes its inspiration from the Easter story. But before we start, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me explain the format of the evening. First, there'll be a short talk on the subject. Then we'll have two personal stories. And finally, a Q&A panel. And this is where you all come in. And I'll be putting any questions or comments that come in from you throughout the evening to the panel. And all you have to do is to type them into either our Facebook page or email them to the address shown below. So I'm going to introduce in a moment Dr. Fraser Hosford. He'll be doing our talk. He's a part-time economist as well as a leader in the church. And again, a reminder, even while he's speaking, just sending your questions. The more we have, the better. Thank you. Fraser.
Thank you, Gladys, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to our talk, our webinar this evening, and our topic is hope. Hope. Hope is pretty much the thing we're all longing for at the moment, isn't it? Even tonight, as the Taoiseach spoke to the nation and there were announcements about the restrictions, we were all sort of waiting for any slight change, any glimpse of hope that things would be different, that the lockdown might get slightly easier for us. We need hope. Hope is good for us. Hope pulls us through difficult situations. Dostoevsky, the famous Russian author, said this. He said, "To live without hope is to cease to live." So hope is necessary for us. Now, this need of hope, it's not new, but I think it's gone up another level. It's gone up a notch in the last year for us in this pandemic. You know, previously, we largely needed hope in particular moments in life, particular spells of life, when we face specific situations. But now we've had this ongoing requirement for hope for over 12 months. The global pandemic is unprecedented for our generations. We haven't lived through anything like this before. And it's done something to us. It has shattered our Western illusion of control and progress, this sense that, you know, we're doing all right and we're going in the right direction, and that things will just keep getting better. Maybe slowly, maybe not evenly, but we're going in the right direction. And with that shattered, now we need hope. And more than ever, we need hope today. And this is a deep thing for us. We've lost over 4,500 people in our country during this pandemic. And all of us have had our lives disrupted to a massive extent for a full 12-month cycle, and a bit still yet to go. So we need hope. And the equation on hope has changed for us all in this year. Now, clearly, the great hope that we are looking to at the moment is the vaccines. And it's been amazing that they've been developed and started being produced so quickly. But we know that the rollout has been slow. So the vaccines are not a silver bullet for us. Not only that, we aren't sure yet at this stage that all of the vaccines will guard against transmission of the virus. And when we talk about vaccines, we largely talk about the Western world. And the rollout in the 2/3 world is going to take years still. So there is no silver bullet here for us. But at a deeper level, the crisis shows us something that is a challenge for us with our notion of progress. It reveals, I think, a paradox and a flaw for us in how we conceive of progress. It seems that part of what has happened here is that our economic progress and development has been at odds with our health progress. Mike Ryan, Dr. Mike Ryan has become probably the most famous Irish doctor at the moment, him of WHO fame, and he said this: His warning was, we are creating the conditions in which epidemics flourish. We're pushing nature to its limits. You see, many of the experts would say that habitat loss has been part of why we're in this pandemic, that humans and animals are now too closely intertwined. That's our result of our progress. And when we look more broadly, we're now, as a society, waking up to the looming threat of climate change. Just this year, we've seen lots of different bits of climate change impacting us in different ways. We've seen devastating bushfires in Australia and California, if you look back and remember them. There's been hurricanes in the Atlantic, and we've had heat waves across the world, all due to climate change. It seems that economic development, rooted in fossil fuels, is at odds with our health progress. It's at the root of this crisis. And so that raises a dilemma for us. It feels like we've placed our hope and our faith in this never-ending progress in human development and technology. But what if that same progress is now endangering us in some ways? Is hope just generated from within humanity, enough for us? Because we know we need hope. Or are we going to look outside? Do we need to look outside for our hope? So given it's Easter week, we thought we would explore the story of Jesus and what it says for hope for us today. So we turn to the resurrection. Now, the resurrection is a funny topic to think about for us. Because on one level, familiarity breeds contempt, and we sort of think we know the story, we've heard this, and there's nothing more to learn. And on another level, to the modern ear, the thought of resurrection just sounds bizarre. The thought of a dead man rising again. We don't even want to go there. I mean, simply put, dead people don't come back to life. Dead means dead. Surely we know that at this moment in history, with all our science and medical knowledge, we know that dead means dead. And for many people, that's where the conversation ends. But I think we need to go a bit deeper. You see, what if that is the whole point of the resurrection? The whole point is that dead people don't rise again, not in the natural world. So if there is one case, at one moment in history, for one human being, where there is evidence to suggest that this person did rise from the dead, then we surely have to sit up and take notice. We have to investigate and look into it and see what does this mean? What could this mean? If it is not explained and goes beyond natural phenomenon, then maybe it's a supernatural phenomenon. And so actually, rather than dismissing the resurrection, we need to explore it. I guess what I want to say is we can't just rule it out automatically. We can't say that a miracle didn't happen 2,000 years ago because miracles don't happen. I mean, that's just a tautology. That's just saying something that's necessarily true. It doesn't advance the conversation or explore anything. All we're doing there is using our naturalistic assumptions to shut down the conversation. Whereas I think what we need to do is look at the history, look at the claims, look at the events, and let that challenge our assumptions and our worldview. See, if you think about it, if there is a God up there, if there is a creator who wants to get in touch with us, and he decided to enter into this world, then how is he going to do that? And what are the repercussions? And surely if he entered into this world, then some of the natural human limitations would be stretched or broken, because it's now God in our world. And if it was human history which God entered into, then certainly there will be marks or traces left in history of this God. And so it's to history that we must turn, not to philosophical assumptions about life in general. And we can't, maybe unfortunately for some, go to science, because that is about repeatable experiments that you can test again and again. Whereas history is the one-off events of life. And it's to there that we turn this evening. So I want to start with with one starting point that we can hopefully agree on, with a generally agreed fact, one piece of data. And that is that the early church themselves believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, we know that this belief was held by virtually all of the early Christians, according to the evidence that's available. And ultimately, this led to the development of a global and millennia-old faith. Now, the persistence of this faith, the stubborn persistence, you may say, of this faith, led the comedian Milton Jones to say this: if the resurrection was fake, then you have to say the scam's gone miraculously well. You know, why has it gone well? Why has and did the early church believe in this? I want to suggest two related reasons for you this evening. And the first is this. The first is the empty tomb. The tomb where Jesus, his broken and dead body was laid, was empty. Now, the simplest argument for this is the inability of both the Romans and the Jews to produce the body. They had every incentive to produce the body. They were anti this early Jesus movement. They wanted to shut it down and stop it. But they didn't or couldn't produce the body to do what they longed to do. But also you can look at the early followers of Jesus themselves. They made enormous life decisions to chuck in their life basically and start anew as Christians, worshippers of a dead would-be Messiah. I mean, they faced persecution and some of them were killed for their faith. Surely they would have gone and checked the evidence themselves, rather than changing their whole lives at all the cost that came with that, just for what could have been a lie. And even actually the earliest Jewish polemic against the Jesus movement said and assumed that the tomb was empty. They talked about how the body was stolen instead. So reason one is that the tomb was empty. And then you combine this with a second reason, which is different meetings and claims of meetings of people that they had with the risen, physical risen Jesus. Now, these appearances were multiple and varied. They happened with different people at different times in different places. And they were recorded soon after the events that happened after the death of Jesus. Many occasions, the people are named. And it happened soon after, so that people could have gone and checked out these witnesses and examined them and say, did that really happen? And so on and so forth, to try and find out what happened behind it. So we have these appearances. And I don't think that these appearances were some form of projection or wish fulfillment on behalf of the disciples. They had no expectation that Jesus was going to rise from the dead. They fled when he was on trial. They proved themselves to not be very good allies to him. Two of them only bothered to check when the claims first emerged. And in three of the appearances, the people didn't even recognize Jesus in the stories that were handed down to us. So they weren't expecting this, and they couldn't in that way have made it up. Not only that, but as Jewish people, while they did have a belief in physical resurrection, the Jewish belief was that resurrection, bodily physical resurrection, would only happen at the end of time, when history itself ended, not within history. And then it would only happen for the whole people, all of God's people, not just for one individual. And so in Jewish history, you have these other people claiming to be messiahs, these other leaders who started a movement and then were killed. But there's no suggestion that they rose from the dead, because that wouldn't make sense to a Jewish mindset. So we can take these two things together. A group of people claiming that they saw the risen Jesus. And this claim is corroborated by an empty tomb. And I think together, these would explain why the early church themselves believed that Jesus rose from the dead. The belief that led to this worldwide Christian church. Now, the challenge is, if we reject this, we maybe reject it or don't even examine it because of our assumptions that can't happen, that miracles can't happen, then we have to explain the miracle of the birth of the church in some other way, other than these two facts. Now, I'm not going to suggest that this brief overview of the resurrection in any way proves it. And it's not the type of thing that can have empirical proof, as we might deem it with data and with science today. But I hope at least to intrigue you in some way that there is history here. But why should you bother to even look into it? Why investigate? What's the importance of this? Why does it matter? In the first talk that the early church gave after the resurrection of Jesus, Peter, one of the early leaders, used this phrase, "but God." As he was doing his talk in Jerusalem, he spoke of the great evil that had happened, of how the corrupt powers of both politics and religion came and colluded together, not just against God's people, or indeed against God's world, but against the very person of God, against the Son of God. But God intervened, and God reversed the outcome of their efforts and rose Jesus from the dead. But as he portrays the story, it is not just a one-off event. What actually happens when Jesus rose from the dead is that he becomes king of this world, or Messiah, as the Jewish people called it. A good king, a loving, generous, and just king. What the resurrection shows is that God is taking charge of his world again. He's reclaiming authority of his world. He's making the world new. You see, I think we misunderstand these claims and the resurrection in at least two ways. I mean, the first, and maybe largely the fault of the church, is that we make the resurrection otherworldly. That all it's about is the fact that Christians can then go to heaven when they die. That's how they themselves beat death. Or secondly, when we look at the claim that it means there's a new world and a new king, and we then look around the world that we live in and see all its problems and sufferings and imperfections and think, that just can't be true. You see, that's not the full story that the scriptures give. When the early Christians preached about a new king after the resurrection, they didn't just go live happily ever after. They didn't claim that the world was suddenly perfect now. They themselves endured waves of violence, as I've already said. There was still sickness and even famine experienced at those times. So they believed in a new kingdom, a new king, a new world that was breaking through. They believed that it was certain, but not that it was complete. They believed that it had started, but that it wasn't finished. That the battle had been won, but the war was still ongoing. To use a famous example, in World War II, it was at D-Day that the decisive battle was won, opening up the Western Front and ensuring that victory was won. That happened in June 1944. And that is like the cross and resurrection of Jesus, the decisive battle. But actually in World War II, the fighting continued for another 11 months until VE Day in May 1945. It was only then that peace was experienced. And likewise, though the decisive battle has been won with the cross and resurrection, the new world doesn't come fully until a later stage. So the victory of Jesus is still being rolled out, even though it is certain and secure. And I just want to list 4 ways in which this gives us hope today. It gives me hope, and it gives some of the other panelists today hope. The first is because Jesus has risen from the dead, he is with us. So we're not alone. Even in dark days like this of pandemic and lockdown, the risen Jesus is with his people. Secondly, he is in us by his Holy Spirit. That's the Christian belief. So we can be changed. It's, my sense, I guess maybe as I become a parent and as I get older, that many of our biggest struggles in life are internal. They come from our own attitudes and behaviors and frailties. And I know for many people, these have come to the fore with the stress and strain of lockdown. And they're the hardest things to change in life. But this new risen King can change us and transform us. He is in us. Thirdly, he is over us and around us. So circumstances of life can and do change. This risen Jesus is still active in our world. He is sustaining our world, protecting it, and intervening in it. So there are these glimpses. Maybe for some of us, particularly now, we feel that they're all too small or few, but there are these glimpses of God's new world breaking in as things change. And lastly, he will come again, and the whole world will be made new. That's our VE day, when everything changes. All suffering will end, pain and sickness, virus and death. And there will be a new, perfect, unimpeachable creation of God's. I want to close with these words from a poet I studied for my Leaving Cert, although I think I'd appreciate her more these days. This is Emily Dickinson, and she said this about hope. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tunes without the words and never stops at all. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. It's this deep, heartfelt definition of hope, not just this vague Irish, sure, it'll be grand, or even the optimism of the green shoots of a new vaccine being rolled out. What this captures for me is this lovely picture of a great future, but one whose expectancy comes from the fact that it's already started in the present. It has perched in our souls. It's already touched us. That St. Peter, who I talked of earlier, called this a living hope. It's a living hope. The seeds of the future have already been sown and are growing in the present. It is our present connection that we can have to this risen Jesus, which gives substance and vibrancy to our future hope. So let me finish by saying that hope is available this evening, that the morning will dawn after the long night, but we have to step into the Easter story. We have to take that step of actually joining ourselves to this risen Jesus. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Fraser. There's a lot of food for thought for everyone listening, including us. I just want to say we've had several questions in already, some via email and a couple direct on our Facebook chat page. So please keep them coming. This is great. Now, the first of our personal stories is going to be shared by Ronnie Granger. He's a husband, a father, a grandfather, and a retired urological surgeon. And as if that isn't enough to keep him busy, he's also a competitor for Transplant Team Ireland in golf and athletics. Ronnie, over to you.
Thank you, Gladys. When I was a young doctor in training here in Ireland in the 1980s, I didn't have a lot of job security. Contracts at that time were either 6 monthly or, if you were fortunate, a year. But if you got onto a specialist training program, in those days it used to be called a senior registrar training program, then you were pretty well assured of a job for at least 3 years. I applied first time and didn't get it. And I was told, you need more general surgery. So within 6 weeks, I had moved to do more general surgery in a hospital in Darlington in County Durham. And in doing so, moved with my wife and 3 young children, all under the age of 5, to live in a hospital flat where I was going to work a 1 and 2 rota. That meant I was up every second night nearly working. So you can imagine that there was a significant amount of fatigue built up during that time. I applied again during that year for a specialist training post and didn't get it. And this time I was told, oh, you need to do more research. So I spent a long time traveling the length and breadth of Britain, from the northeast of England to the southwest down to Bristol, to the southeast to Canterbury, to the Midlands, to Stockport and Sheffield and Leeds. And each time I went, I'd get the story, oh, you'd be a great fit for this job. We'll phone you tonight. But the phone never rang. So you can imagine that with that background of fatigue, with the prospect of unemployment, with no job to go to and probably no house to go back to in Ireland, I was feeling pretty low. And for the first time in my life as an adult, I cried. I was despondent. I really didn't know what to do. But I was reading my Bible at that time, and there were two passages in the Bible that spoke to me very directly. One was from Psalm 118, and it said, it's far better to trust or to take refuge in God than trust in people. I'd been putting my trust in all these people who were going to phone me and who never did. And the second piece of the Bible that spoke to me was 1 Corinthians in the New Testament, in chapter 10 and verse 13, and it says this: no test or temptation that comes your way is beyond the course of what others have had to face. All you need to remember is that God will never let you down. He'll never let you be pushed past your limit. He'll always be there to help you come through it. When I read those words, it was like a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. I didn't have any solutions to my predicament, but I knew whom I could trust. And so I was at peace. I had hope. I didn't know what the hope would look like, but amazingly, within a few weeks, things turned around and there was an unfolding of events that led us coming back to Ireland with much better notice this time of 2 weeks. So it reminded me in some ways of a figure that I'd read about as a child in a book called The Pilgrim's Progress, which is a book written by a man called John Bunyan. And it's an allegory, really, of Christianity and the Christian life. And Pilgrim's name in the book is Christian. And he was a bit like me. He was carrying an enormous burden on his shoulders. And he went through what's called the slough of despond. So he was as despondent as I was. But in the Pilgrim's Progress, he walks up the hill to the foot of the cross, and his burden rolls off his back. And where does it roll to? Into an open tomb, never to be seen again. So I had hope, but I didn't see the answer coming. So fast forward now 20 years. We're now in 2003. And even back in Darlington, I knew then that I was going to suffer from renal failure. I had a condition that would eventually cause both my kidneys to fail. So in February 2003, I was listed for a renal transplant. And in October of that year, I started dialysis. But wonderfully, in November of that year, I received a transplant. I want you to try and imagine how I felt. Here I was being given this enormous gift, this gift of new life from a family who were in deep grief. Their compassion and generosity gave me this wonderful gift of new life. And as we're talking this evening, we're just at the end of Donor Awareness Week in this country. And I don't know if you've ever seen one of these cards, but it's a donor card in the unexpected and hopefully never to happen episode of death. This would let you know, let your family know exactly how you feel about helping others by donating your organs. And if you haven't got one of these, I'd encourage you to get one. or at least have the chat with your family and think about it. This shirt I'm wearing is the shirt of Transplant Team Ireland, and our logo on the shirt is Loving New Life. Now here we are in Easter week, and I've got two causes to love new life. I love new life for this wonderful gift that I have been given of a new kidney. But I love it even more because of the relationship I have with God, because of what Jesus has done for me, the gift that God has given me so that I can have new life in Jesus and have it, as he put it, in all its fullness.
Thank you, Ronnie. Really appreciate your honesty there. Very, very moving. Now, for the second personal story, I'm going to introduce Joan Singleton. She teaches at third level in a Christian college, and she also teaches and gives talks to churches and community groups in pastoral care. I'll hand over to you, Joan.
Thanks, Gladys. Well, part of my story I want to tell you tonight that's relevant to tonight means going back a few years, or some of you who know me know that it means going back longer than a few years, because I'm going back to when I was 18. When I was 18, I went to college in Belfast because I was living in County Antrim. And even though I only travelled 15 miles to Belfast and was home every weekend, it was as though I had gone to the other side of the world. And for various reasons, I felt as though my whole life was being taken and shaken apart. I'd grown up on a farm, youngest of 5 children, very secure, going to church regularly, believing everything that I was told about God and so on. And then here at college, I was studying geography and geology, and eventually did archaeology as well, just to throw in another ology. And I was hearing things about the earth and about the origins of the earth and about all this kind of stuff that I actually hadn't heard before. And it caused me to be really shaken. And there were other things going on as well in my family that just made me very shaky. And I really felt as though I'd been set adrift. I ended up eventually going to see a doctor and being diagnosed with depression. And underneath all of this was this big question. And it was this: was what I believed about God just because of where I'd grown up, because of the family I'd grown up in, and because I'd been taken along to church? And if I'd grown up in a different culture, maybe I wouldn't believe any of it. So that was one question. But a far more serious question that shook me to my core was this: what if it was all not true? What if it was all lies? What if it was just stories? What if God didn't exist? If there was no God, no Jesus, all of that. And that really did bring real blackness into my life. Because I can remember thinking, well, what's the purpose? Why do a degree? What will happen after that? Will I get a good job, earn money, maybe have a family? But what's the point if this life is just that's it and there's nothing and then you just die? And it was a horrible time, really horrible, just to think that there was no purpose to life and therefore no hope. Why do it? Why do all this work and so on? And I don't know who at the time or how it happened, but somehow I got hold of a book that I think is still available, even though it was written way back, but it was called this Who Moved the Stone? And it was by a lawyer called Frank Morrison. And I don't know who gave it to me, where I got it, but this guy, Frank Morrison, was an atheist. And he decided all these Christians talking about the resurrection, and this is the kind of basis of their beliefs, I'm going to disprove it. So he set out to disprove the resurrection. He examined, went through all the evidence and so on, and he became a follower of Jesus. because he found the stuff that Fraser was talking about earlier. He found enough evidence, enough concrete stuff to make him think not only that Jesus had actually lived, but they had actually come back from the dead to be alive again, still alive, and that he was God. And that book had a major impact on me. And then I went back to the other source documents, the Gospels, and read there about Jesus and what he was like, and became convinced that it was true. So that was one big step. Second one was this, though. If it's true, then that affects all of my life. And because that means that then Jesus can, as Fraser said, Jesus can live in my life. Jesus can live through me. And ever since then, Jesus has been the foundation of my life. Wherever I've lived, whether I've lived in Cork or England or Thurles, and I have to mention Thurles because it's centre of the universe in County Tip. I'm now in Dublin. The fact that Jesus is alive means that I can read about him in the Bible because it's about a real person. I can know him, I can talk to him, and he controls everything in my life, controls my ambitions, my money, everything. But it's because he's real and he's alive. And because he is alive now, he can be known personally. So am I glad I went through that horrible time? No, I'm not. But I am glad that I looked at the Christian faith as an adult and really kind of, with my limited mind, examined it as much as I could. And so glad that I'm convinced that it's all real and it's all true. So therefore, Easter every year, well, the resurrection is true all year, but every time we get to Easter, I rejoice because it's not just a story, it's real. And that means that Jesus is alive today in the pandemic, and that gives us hope.
Thank you, Joan, for sharing. That's very, very personal. We really appreciate that. Okay, the questions are coming in. It's not too late to keep sending them in, folks. Okay, so the panel will be made up of Fraser, Joan, and Ronnie, who've all spoken. So I'm going to pick a couple first that were emailed earlier, and then we'll go on to the live chat ones. Okay, the first one is, but is this evidence you talk of not just all taken from the Bible? Why would those who don't have faith accept it? Right, who would like to answer that one?
I might have a first crack at that anyway, just because it probably relates to some of what I was saying. So I talked of three things. And so the answer is probably yes and no in terms of, is it from the Bible? I mean, the main thing I talked of was the central fact that the early church believed that Jesus rose from the dead. And this was behind this then growth and development of the church around the world, etc. And so that is just history. That's not just within the scriptures. That is history. We have whatever 2 billion Christians in the world today. So that was the central fact. And then there was sort of two reasons underneath it. The first was the empty tomb. And of course, yeah, it does mention that in the scriptures. But it also, I guess, is history in the sense that there's no recording of anyone finding the body in the tomb or Jesus remains elsewhere. But it's also logic as well, because as I said, the Romans and Jews couldn't produce the body. And then the second reason was the resurrection appearances. These are recorded for us in the scripture, so in that sense, they're from the Bible. But even if you don't have faith, which is fair enough, you don't have faith, so you don't think the Bible is divine in that sense, it's still a historical document. So it still shows what the early followers of Jesus claimed. And it still needs to be engaged with on that basis, I suggest.
Okay. Yep, Joan.
If I could just say something about that as well. one of the big things for me was realizing that a lot of Jesus followers, the disciples, some of them actually died or were put to death because they said they were Christian. They said that Jesus was alive. And others went and traveled and preached about Jesus and talked about him. They wouldn't have done that for a lie. They wouldn't have done it if they knew it was fake and if they knew that he hadn't died. So that was a big, for me, that's a major thing. The fact of how they lived on the basis that actually they'd seen Jesus who was alive.
Great. Thanks, Joan. Right, Ronnie, you don't have to say anything. Would you like to? Otherwise, I'll go to another question.
I'll just say that from a historical point of view, there's no doubt that Jesus lived on this earth. He's not a fantasy. There's plenty of corroborative evidence from historians of the time that Jesus lived. And nowhere do you find the story of the resurrection dished by anybody. You know, this seems to me to be the kernel of our belief as Christians. If Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, there wouldn't have been much point to his death. But if we believe in a spiritual warfare, as we do, that there are evils that work in this world, then the good that Jesus accomplished on our behalf was defeating that, which is death is the final weapon of that. So that's why I believe.
Great. Thanks, all of you. Right. Another good question here. If God can do miracles like the resurrection, then why doesn't he do more of them? Good question there. So who would like to? Oh, Fraser.
Well, I've unmuted anyway. I mean, that's a massive question, and I don't know that it's one you can answer in every scenario, you know, because obviously there's very personal and emotional issues where you're longing for a miracle. But I guess what I tried to outline and use that example of World War II, of D-Day and VE Day, is the sense that it has started, but it hasn't finished. So Jesus is king and he's remaking this world, but it's not fully remade, not fully perfect and better until Jesus comes back. And so that means that everything's not perfect and that there's not always miracles and that we live in a world subject to natural constraints and limitations. But there are times when God intervenes. But then there will be this ultimate miracle of a whole new world that will be remade. This very physical world we live in will be remade, and it will just be good.
Okay, thanks, Fraser. Does anyone else want to come in on that, or we'll move on? Okay, I'm going on to one of the ones that have just has come in while you've been speaking. How is this hope relevant or even helpful to individuals who are seriously broken and perhaps incapable of functioning society? For example, mentally ill, terminally ill, chronically homeless, etc. Wow. Okay, who's going to tackle that one? Jo.
So difficult, because there's so much pain and brokenness in the world and so many people suffering. I think it does make a huge difference to people in their brokenness to know that Jesus is with them. It doesn't necessarily sort everything out, but I think it does give hope. I'd love to think that then things could be sorted, but since that time when I was 18, I've experienced depression again in my life after my first child was born, and that was a horrible time, but I did have the foundation under it that somehow God was with me because Jesus was alive. It didn't take all the pain away, and it doesn't for people. And we would never say that, but it does make a big difference in suffering to know that God cares and that Jesus is with you. But we're talking about just a very complex, very difficult, painful topic, I think.
Thanks, Joan. Yeah, it's almost opens up to a whole topic in itself, doesn't it? Would anyone else? Ronnie, over to you. Thank you.
It is an extraordinarily difficult question to answer. I think all of us have experienced the pain of people that we loved, and maybe even taking their own lives because they couldn't cope anymore. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that. All I can say is that we as believers in Jesus are called to try and minister to those who are in need and those who are suffering. And that's a challenge to us to go and do that. But there is no doubt that Jesus can deliver people out of this gloom and doom. Why it doesn't always happen, I don't know. But he wasn't accepted by everybody when he was here. He was rejected by many.
Yeah, just I guess another perspective to add is Jesus expressed in his life and ministry this heart for the marginalized and sought them out to heal them and just to be with them. And I think it's important to see that. And just generally what I guess we call the incarnation, the fact that Jesus entered into this world and became a person, a human being, meant that he experienced life. And so the help that he can bring is help that is through experience, that he knows what isolation is like, what rejection and betrayal is like, that his own family didn't understand him, didn't accept him, that the people he came to minister to, the Jewish people, rejected him and tried to kill him. So he went through such a range of human emotions that I think he can help us in these situations.
Thank you, Fraser. Thanks, guys. This one, I think, sort of follows on. Can't we ultimately have hope without God? There's a good question. Who would like to tackle that one first?
I'd like to ask the question in return. In what then do you hope? If your hope is in the things that you have here, that's no hope at all. The things that we have around us don't offer us anything. But if we have relationship, and relationship for all time, that gives us hope. And that's what I believe Jesus offers.
Just to add, I think it's a really good question. And obviously there's different levels of hope. You know, there's things, you know, I hope for a sunny day and get to go for an ice cream and a walk with the kids. So there's these different levels of hope. And we do hope for different things on different levels. I guess adding to Ronnie's point that if we don't believe in God, we don't believe in anything outside of our world and our system, then the hope that we have is more limited, because we're not believing in a sort of an ultimate cause or an ultimate purpose, so we can't have that come in to help us in some way. And also, I think if we do hope in other things, that shows something about our life as well. I mean, I hope in lots of different things, but it says something about us. It says something that we trust in these things, that we actually place maybe too much value in, be it the things of money or whatever it might be. And I think there's a danger attached there as well for us.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, just going back up on the questions. Can we depend on the records we have of the resurrection? Joan.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an historian, but yes, stuff that greater minds than me have written have made me feel that, yeah, we can rely on it. And the stuff we were saying earlier about historians who wrote, not Christian historians, but historians who wrote about Jesus having lived. And then how do you explain what happened after his death? So I think somebody said once, and Fraser or Ronnie might know this, but somebody said once that there is far more evidence that Jesus lived and died and came back to life than there is for a lot of the stuff that we do in school in history. A lot of figures like Julius Caesar and others that we, of course, we accept they definitely lived, that there's actually more data and evidence for the fact of the events around Jesus living and dying and coming back to life again.
Yeah, I think there's different ways into this question that people look at. Again, I'm not an expert like Joan, but I find some of the evidence persuasive. And so one of the things is the nature of the accounts, that some of the details that they have in the resurrection accounts and in the Bible stories and Gospels in general, they put in unpopular or unlikely things, which give it this hint that it actually is eyewitness testimony. There's these details that the first witnesses of the resurrection were women. Now, if you were trying to fabricate a story, you wouldn't do this, because in most cases, female testimony wasn't accepted in a court of law. So you weren't producing good witnesses according to the legal standard of the day. So if it was being made up, you'd have no reason to do that. So it gives that hint of credibility that this was eyewitness testimony. There's a little detail as well, I know, I think it's John's Gospel and his account, that when the disciples ran to the early tomb, they bent over to look in. Now, history shows us that the only tombs in those days where you would have to bend over were these, I think they were called bench tombs, which wealthy people had. Now, at the same time, the Gospels tell us that he was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, who was a member of the ruling council of Sanhedrin. So it fits that just tiny little detail in the accounts actually makes sense of what we later find out historically about the nature of tombs. I think more generally, I mean, there are what are considered sort of false gospels, Gnostic gospels out there, Gospel of Thomas, some of the stuff that's made popular with the Da Vinci Code and stuff, which are a few hundred years after Jesus. And they are very different in nature and how they talk about these things than the historic four gospels in the scriptures in the biblical canon. And so they'll have far more commentary. They embellish and have these great stories in the Gospels and put theological meanings, saying what this means. Whereas you read, the four Gospels and the Scriptures, sometimes it's hard work being a preacher, because it doesn't really tell you what it means, because it's just an eyewitness account saying someone went to the tomb and they found this and they had this meeting, and you have to, find out quite what it means. So there's a number of reasons, I think, that give credibility to those Gospels.
Great, thanks, Fraser. Now, this probably will be the last question, as we're almost at 9 o'clock. Why aren't Christians changed dramatically like Jesus was in the resurrection? Now, there's a question. Who wants to give that a go?
Well, as the least changed person on here, I'll let someone else answer first.
I think I would say that we're a work in progress. It's like a renovation, if you like. Jesus coming in, we hand over control of our lives to him, and from then on he's working through our lives, but we're not. Jesus is perfect and we're not. So we should, and I'm sorry to those friends who know me, we should be becoming more Christ-like as we get older. But Jesus is the only one who's perfect. But yes, each of us, and that's why I need to keep looking at Jesus and reading about him in the Bible and talking to God and praying and asking him to change me. I can't sit back and kind of say, okay, so I think that's a real challenge. I think the change is possible, but I need to cooperate with God because he didn't make me follow him. And therefore he doesn't make me every day take the opportunity to learn and become more like him. But it is a process, and he is doing it.
I might throw in one image that is used in the scriptures around this is fruit, like the fruit on a tree, and so there's a couple of things that one is fruit grows. It's not instantaneous, and so there is the picture is giving us is that it's gradual, that it happens over time. So that is a difference from Jesus' resurrection. But the other part of it also is that, when it talks about this, it talks about good fruit and bad fruit, and it tells you the nature of the tree. Is it a good tree or a bad tree? And so there is a sense in which fruit's really important. And there are people who talk of faith and church and religion and whatever you have, but actually their fruit doesn't show the truth of that. They don't practice what they might preach. And I guess we're also aware of that in Ireland, and it's something that we need to note, and that all that we claim is not necessarily true of us.
That's great. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate you taking part, Joan, Fraser and Ronnie. Thank you for all the work you've put in and for sharing so honestly. If any of you who are watching have follow-up questions, or even if you're not watching this live, and you can still put questions in the chat or email us. We'll put a slide at the end with details on it, and we will get back to you, we promise. And thank you to all of you who did send questions, some really good ones there. And I'd like to say before we go that if anyone watching, you feel that you're in a place where you've lost hope, you feel isolated or alone, or if anything has impacted you in any way from this evening, please contact us and someone will get back to you in strictest confidence. And we will be running another webinar on another topic, date and subject to be decided. If you are interested, then simply friend us on Facebook and we'll let you have the details when we get them. So as I say, if you want our details at the end, don't leave immediately. Stay on for another minute or so. Our details will come up. And so finally, thank you for joining us. And please continue to take care of yourself and stay safe. Good night.